The Steve Bannon interview is making a lot of noise in the country underneath the turbulence of storms. We'll talk about it tonight.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
You know, I was thinking this morning as I was getting ready for my day jobs, just like you do, thinking, boy, the president's actually been pretty well behaved in the last week or so. I don't know why that is. Is there a corner turn? Is the chief of staff actually making some inroads and calming this thing down? Or is the hurricane season just a dominant force and kind of suppressing everything else that Donald Trump might say or do or whatever? But I've rather enjoyed the calm, you know, during the storm. Unfortunately, the storms have not been anything that we have enjoyed. Nice to have you in. Thank you for joining my State of Mind. Political sociologist from Brown University, Professor Michael Kennedy, joins me. He's always compelling, and I think he's got a lot to say on this Bannon interview that aired Sunday night on 60 Minutes. Along with it, Hillary Clinton spoke. So we'll talk about her kind of at the end of the program because she's kind of, I don't know, just, you know, unhinged. Well, unhinged is probably an overstatement, but she's getting after it. There's no doubt about it. So Mr. Bannon actually said something that, interestingly, didn't even make the cut of the 60 Minutes Sunday night interview. I thought it was actually the most profound thing he said, and here it is.
Someone said to me that you described the firing of James Comey. You're a student of history as the biggest mistake in political history.
That would probably be too bombastic even for me, but maybe modern political history.
So, the firing of James Comey was the biggest mistake in modern political history.
If you're saying that that's associated with me, then I'll leave it at that.
I thought that was pretty profound, Professor Kennedy, don't you?
Even if it was sounding a bit bombastic, I think I agree. I think it was a huge mistake, you know, tactically, but it doesn't eliminate what the original problem was. And that is, Russians were doing something in this election, and we have to get to the bottom of it. Comey was going to do it, and Trump would have probably had more control over the process about how he was going to do it. But because he fired Comey, now we have obstruction of justice as part of the things that our new special investigator is investigating.
By the way, welcome. Always great to see you.
Nice to see you.
The lane that Comey would have been going down was fairly restricted. The lane that Mr. Mueller now has as the special ain't restricted at all. And I think that's what Bannon is talking about. I think Bannon is saying biggest mistake because he knows more through his access to classified information and the like. He knows more about what might be coming down the pike. That's there's no inference, there's no empirical evidence yet that this is the biggest political mistake in modern history, modern day history. This, unless and until it has ramifications, right?
Right. So obviously Bannon knows something about where this is going to lead. And you know, the fact that Mueller is looking into these financial dealings, which I've said on your show many times, this is the bedrock of the problem, because Trump is somehow implicated in Russian business and government in ways that he has so far tried to hide. But when Mueller comes out with all of this information, he's not going to be able to hide it any longer.
Yeah, I don't know. What's your overall take on the Bannon interview and what this whole thing? We have plenty of excerpts from it that I think are pretty fascinating, but the overall impression you got was what?
So I would start by asking why Bannon did this at all, because this is his first televised interview. Right. And some people
since he was part of the White House.
Yeah.
Right.
So since some people are going back to that Time magazine cover. Remember when he was the most important man or something like that? So obviously he's feeding his ego. But there's something much more significant about this. And I think that whether it's calculated or merely coincidental, what this is doing is shifting the terms of the game. Because Bannon knows and Trump knows that they're pretty good in a street fight, as as Bannon himself said, but they're terrible at governance. And so in order to preserve Trump's rule, they need to shift the political discourse toward how to fight and who's still in the swamp and who's not, and away from the problems of governance that Trump has overseen.
Do you think, I didn't get a sense one way or the other as to whether Bannon recognizes or would agree with you that there's an admittance that they're not good at governing. I'm not sure I got that.
No,
I know,
absolutely.
I know that he's a self-proclaimed street fighter. He called himself that in the interview.
Right.
Do you think they have a cognizance to their deficiency in governing?
Yes. Because in that interview, Bannon said at the very start that the problem was, the original sin, I think was the term, the original sin of the administration was to bring in the old guard into governance. And the reason they had to do that is because as a campaign, they didn't have enough experience to govern. They're dependent on Mitch McConnell to push things through. They're dependent on the Speaker of the House to push things through. But the problem is that both McConnell and Ryan are not on the same page as Trump.
Yeah, I think in our next segment we're going to talk about the fissures that are existing in the Republican Party right now. But going back to the Russian thing here for just a second, here's what he talked about in terms of the Russian investigation being a kind of a non-starter.
There's nothing to the Russia investigation. It's a waste of time.
What do you believe? You know what the national security institutions believe. What do you believe?
What do you mean what they believe? We don't really, I mean, that there may have been, I think, look, I was there. It's a total and complete farce. Russian collusion is a farce.
Okay, I didn't say collusion. Did the Russians try to influence the election?
If you consider maybe something they did at the DNC.
Maybe something they did?
Maybe something.
That's not what the CIA believes. That's not what the FBI believes.
Have you seen the intelligence reports?
No.
Okay, fine. So you don't know.
Have you seen the intelligence reports?
I have seen the intelligence reports.
And are you saying to me those intelligence reports do not suggest that the Russians tried to influence the election?
I would never devolve classified information on this show. But let me tell you, I think it's far from conclusive that the Russians had any impact on this election.
Well, that's not the question. Did they try to influence the American election? That's what the investigation is about.
We'll have to wait till the investigation is finished.
You know, Charlie pressed him, I think, the right way. He has this air of confidence when he asserts something. When tested, he folds up like a wilted lily. I think that's very interesting, don't you?
I think that's a great diagnosis. You know, he is the master of manipulation if he knows what his script is. So no doubt he was thinking about what to say in advance. And then when Charlie pushed him, he had to deflect.
Yeah, but the push, although, you know, well constructed, is not rocket science. It's the same push I would make, the same push you would make. I mean, this is not. This is, and there is a distinction with a difference between outcome of election and attempted interference or successful interference in the election discourse. Those are two very different things, and he gets it. And you know, having been privy to all of these classified documents and still not being able to assert emphatically that there's nothing there, I think is problematic. It doesn't match up, by the way. His whole assertion that there's nothing there doesn't match up with the Mueller, with the Comey thing being the biggest political mistake in history. There's a disconnect between those two assertions, isn't there?
If the political mistake was to fire Comey and therefore to invite investigations into obstruction of justice, that's the way in which it can hang together.
Well, you keep hanging on obstruction of justice, but, and I think that's a valid thing, but I think it's the financial stuff that is wholly more impactful.
Right. That's right. So, and that's why, because Comey wouldn't have been able to get into the financial side. Now Mueller will. So that's the huge political mistake. But one thing on Bannon's confidence, his legions are listening to the first part of that question. They are ignoring the second. They're going to retain this Russia investigation as a farce. That's what they're going to take to their beer conversations and say, that's just a farce. So Bannon is giving their most emphatic supporters the language with which to dismiss all evidence to the contrary.
So?
And so that's the way in which
what's the nickname in that? The base is the base is the base is the base.
So they need to keep feeding the base. so that the base remains committed. Because, and here I think this is a
Okay, I
really
see what you're
interesting
saying.
point.
So that in and of itself is
Right.
is a tool.
Trump is more than an individual. Trump and Bannon have helped to create a social movement in this country that is going to outlast Trump. And so this is one of the biggest issues that we have to live with. A, we have a whole base of people who don't care about what the truth is, only care about whether you're loyal to Trump or not. And then what happens with that after Trump is gone? We'll have some other leader that carries the mantle.
Well, carrying, if you're saying Bannon and Trump have created this new movement, Bannon certainly would have theorized it. I don't think that Donald Trump has. I don't think Donald Trump is participatory in creating a new movement.
No, but he's become the symbol, and people can put all of this stuff into Trump and say, this is what I believe, and he speaks, and then they ignore him when he's collaborating with Pelosi and Schumer. They say, that's not that important. That's because Bannon isn't there.
Got it. All right, when we come back, we'll talk about what happens to the Republicans, because they are broken right now. Stay with us.
My problem, and I told General Kelly this, when you side with a man, you side with him. I was proud to come out and try to defend President Trump in the media that day.
Are there no exceptions in terms of siding with someone?
You can tell him, hey, maybe you could do it a better way, but if you're going to break, then resign. If you're going to break with him, resign. The stuff that was leaked out that week by certain members of the White House I thought was unacceptable. If you find it unacceptable, you should resign.
So
That day was, I believe, if I recall correctly, it was DACA, was the discussion of, hanging on for 6 months and creating some kind of room for Congress to legislate. The currency of loyalty seems to be more important than what in this organization, in this administration?
Principle. Charlie Dent, the congressman, the Republican congressman from Bethlehem. Exactly.
Right, yeah.
Bethlehem I grew up in. So I know this guy, I know the way he talks. And I'm really sorry, even though I'm a Democrat, I'm really sorry to see him not running. And he said that there has always been a contest within the GOP.
Straight to the point, Charlie Dent is a Republican congressman who I think has had 6 terms, and he's on his 7th, and has decided that he's not going to run. Not exclusively blaming it on Trump, by the way, but the environment that surrounds everything in Washington. Yeah.
And this is the problem with this environment. He said before we had meaningful debates between those who are purists, in his words, and those who are pragmatists, which he would call himself. That debate still simmers, but it's been overshadowed by the debate between loyalists to Trump and those who are sticking to their principles. And I think it's really important to think about the ways in which we can see these principles operating. Because sometimes people are compromising because they're pragmatic, principled people, but sometimes they're just caving because they're afraid of what Trump and Bannon can do in Republican primaries.
This DACA thing, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, was, a week's worth of news before the storms hit. It's kind of quieted down, and when the storms quiet down, it'll pop back up. You believe that Congress can actually get a standalone bill for a resolution legislatively to replace the executive order by Barack Obama?
I pray, but they've demonstrated complete lack of governance capability. So I think the only way that this is going to happen is if the constituents of all of these Congress people say, you can't do this to these DACA people. You can't. And that would be an abrogation of moral responsibility.
I don't think that's going to happen.
And I don't think so either.
I think 80% of America says, leave the kids alone, but they're not going to storm the congressional phone lines to demand it.
But, there are principled leaders in our civil society, faith leaders, for example, religious people, who are stepping up and making this a central plank of their demand for a moral country.
Well, speaking of church leaders, Bannon had a little bit of a dispute with his own Catholic Church over this entire immigration thing.
Remind you, a good Catholic, that Cardinal Dolan is opposed to what's happening with DACA. Cardinal Dolan.
The Catholic Church has been terrible about this.
Okay,
the bishops have been terrible about this. By the way, you know why? because unable to really to come to grips with the problems in the church, they need illegal aliens. They need illegal aliens to fill the churches. It's obvious on the face of it. That's what the entire Catholic bishops condemning. They have an economic interest. They have an economic interest in unlimited immigration, unlimited illegal immigration. And as much as I respect
that's a tough thing to say about your church.
As much as I respect Cardinal Dolan and the bishops on doctrine, this is not doctrine. This is not doctrine at all.
Fascinating. Cardinal Dolan had a response, we'll post it here. Yeah. I always love it when even the Cardinal does the passive-aggressive thing. I really don't care to comment on what is a preposterous and rather insulting statement. The only reason we bishops care for immigrants is for the economics, because we want to fill our churches and get more money. That's a very complicated conversation. But I think more complicated is what the Republicans are going to do with this entire whole thing. I mean, Trump is actually asking for legislation on DACA as part of an entire immigration reform package, which to him means wall. I'm not going to get a wall. This whole wall thing is a complete non-starter, I think. Do you agree?
I agree. It solves nothing except for allowing
Democrats
Trump.
will never participate in that conversation.
No, and this is why this for me is a test. Trump has failed all my tests so far. I'm giving him one more test. Can he pass the sincerity test? He says he's cared about these DACA kids, as he calls them, for all this time. If he cares, then have the Congress pass legislation about DACA and leave everything else out of it. Because if he insists on the wall being part of it, he is deliberately destroying the possibility for these DACA people to stay in this country.
What happens to this Republican Party, real quick? What happens?
It's going to be torn apart in this coming election. Bannon knew it, but he's not just knowing it in prediction. He's going to help to destroy it. He's going to run far-right candidates who are loyal to Trump and try to destroy those pragmatic folks in Republican elections. And principled.
Endgame being what?
To keep up the fight. Because they can't govern, they have to, look over here, distract us for a second, and keep fighting, focusing on the fight.
What's intrinsically good about the fight?
Enable Trump to get reelected.
What's intrinsically good about that?
Nothing.
Hillary Clinton will probably agree. She's mouthing off. We'll talk about that next.
Her very first speech when she came off the beach was nonsense. And this goes to something I want to address with you. Hillary Clinton's not very bright. Everybody says she's so smart, so much smarter than Donald Trump. She doesn't really have a grasp. She doesn't have a grasp on what's important and what's not. And that's what's essential in a leader.
I agree that a leader must be able to grasp what's important and what's not. But you also have to be able to judge the quality of their grasp. And to my mind, when we have repeal and replace, building the wall, deporting immigrants, I mean, that's not important. Infrastructure is important, and they can't get it done. Actually, I went to see Hamilton a couple weeks ago, and what's one of those great lines in there? Immigrants get it done. Well, I think Trump is missing the boat.
Bannon suggesting that Hillary's not very smart is puzzling to me. I don't know how you would say that Hillary Clinton's not very smart. I think her political instincts are not very good. I think there's a difference between the two, don't you?
I think what he's pointing to is something meaningful, and that is Hillary Clinton is a wonderful, if I can say, policy-leading president. She knows policy.
You have to be smart to be a policy leader.
You have to be really smart. We have a school for public policy at Brown, and we're turning out really smart students, and we have really smart faculty. Perez is now visiting with us, but
former chairman of the Democratic National Committee.
But what is different is how to be a mobilizing leader. It's not just having, quick phrases. It's being able to intuit the future, not to fix the present.
Well, listen, she was part of the establishment. It's as simple as that. She says, by the way, she's going to keep working, but she ain't running.
Is your political career over?
Yes. As an active politician, it's over.
You will never be a candidate for office?
I am done with being a candidate, but I am not done with politics because I literally believe that our country's future is at stake.
I don't believe that. I just don't. Yeah, we'll see if she's gonna continue to lead conversation in this country. She'll have. Listen, she's got a market share that's significant. I hate to break it to everybody, but she was the popular vote winner in that election. Yes. But I can see that she could easily, have that interview thrown at her when she decides to take another run at this thing and say, you know what, I suddenly realized, in order to be able to affect the change I'm trying to affect, I've got to be the one to bring it across the goal line. So do you think she's done? I don't think she's done.
I think she should be done. I mean, I have many friends who are avid Hillary supporters, and I certainly voted for her in the election, but it's time for a different generation. And there are so many capable and inspiring folks. I mean, look at Barack Obama was a different generation. That was one of the reasons he could bring hope and change. And we're going to need a lot of hope to make up for all the things that Trump did.
She suggested that America was not ready for a woman, that the misogyny in this race kind of took its hold. Really? Certainly, with all the baggage she brought to the table, I think she diminished the opportunity that people had to be excited about electing a woman.
She brought a lot of baggage, yeah. But there was certainly misogyny in this election.
No doubt, but there would be for any woman running.
Not the same kind. Because they were able to target her in ways that were linked to her experience as First Lady, linked to her relationship with Bill Clinton. I mean, one of the people that I think about as an extraordinarily impressive person, only first-term senator, is Kamala Harris, right? If you saw her in those hearings,
she was awesome.
Comey, she was awesome, and this is the kind of person I think that's going to inspire.
But she was talked down by the chair.
Exactly, and that kind of misogyny is the kind of thing that won't go anywhere because that was blatant and crude. The kind of misogyny that was operating around Hillary could pretend like it wasn't.
Do you agree with my, we only have a half a minute or so, do you agree with my original premise at the top of the show that the president has kind of calmed it down a little bit? We might have some more serene waters here, or is it just the storm that's...
I think the storm calmed it down.
Yeah.
Because this is one thing about America. We do come together in crisis. We need to when we saw what happened in Florida and Texas. But he has to show me, this is another test, can he carry forward that goodwill? I doubt it.
What's the next couple of months bring?
Intense conflict within the Republican Party, where you have, what's his name, Meadows from North Carolina, challenging Ryan from Wisconsin for the leadership of the House. I think this is going to come.
And Bannon kind of lighting that fire all the way through.
Bannon's going to be stoking the fire.
Interesting. Do you read Breitbart? Do you?
Sometimes.
It's okay to say that, You should read everything. Keeps you informed. Good to see you.
Nice to see you.
Professor Michael Kennedy. Final word, we got an interesting couple of shows coming up this week next. Speaking of the hurricane, a hurricane expert from URI joins us tomorrow so we can talk about what's next for us, hopefully not. And President Dooley from URI joins us on Thursday. That'll be good. See you on the radio at 3 on WPRO tomorrow. Thanks so much for watching. Good night.